Hello everyone, today we talk about Francis of Assisi. Recently we made video on the Franciscans and the Dominicans, their genesis mostly in their spread in the field of education, and it's worth reflecting on this protagonist, not just of course the founder of the Franciscan order, and we've seen also the controversies around properly the concept, the will. He was more for a broader movement rather than the creation of an order, but still, this is Francis' leitmotif. It was the full obedience to the church, right? Even when in disagreement, and in practice, without the possibility even of criticism, which would have appeared according to him as a lack of faith or complete faith in the church, and therefore in the same God, but also, in fact, one of the greatest figures in Western spirituality. That, of course, would require much greater video than this one. Likely, like basically any topic at this point, we know that we're time allowing. We will probably talk again multiple times about the same topic. This one is really important, and as the first video on it, as an introductory one, it's really relevant to get things right, or getting the fundamentals right. So, because you see, the exceptional figure of Saint Francis has been in the centuries following his earthly experience, let's say, object of historiographical debates of the most varied interpretations, also of artistical inspiration. You know that some of the greatest gems in Western art fundamentally have to do also with the depiction of Francis' life and so on. Probably would have not liked that much, especially the cycle that Giotto magnificently created about him, exactly because of his modesty and his lack of fuss and pomp, let's say. But it's still one of those topics that it's heavily debated academically because of a bit the obvious difficulties relative to the times and places. Some debates are also about details that maybe are not radically influent on the essence of Francis, but the latter is also in fact a very interesting field of research because of the enormous implications that such a figure had in the Europe of the time that we have tried to describe recently, especially in the History of Christianity series in the at the beginning of the 13th century, the end of the 12th, beginning of the 13th, as one of the most tormented phases in Western Christianity, this moment almost of refoundation of papal monarchy, in a struggle against the heresies, in a phase of expansion, but also of instability, even in the clash against the infidels. And so, also, of course, stemming from properly the fabric, the political and social fabric of Europe at the time, that Francis himself embodied dramatically well. Right, as most characters that sometimes people maybe are not interested. I don't know how many people are gonna click on this video. I noticed that history of the church apparently doesn't interest as many people as other sometimes trivial topics, and that is the sad measure of how low we have fallen culturally and educationally in general. Right, this is not that you have to be interested in it forcibly, of course, nor this has to do with whether you believe in God or not. But I presume that not understanding the meaning of such topics or not having curiosity in it actually does reflect, at best, a disorientation, right, and probably a lack of historical concreteness, right? Because this is not the history of just the poor, right, the humble, the juggler of God, let's say, and this also extreme figure, in many characters of his existence, also a controversial one in a sense. I mean, at least relatively to the interpretation, the broader meaning of certain actions and even of relevant international, character. For example, the meeting with the Sultan Al-Kamil, and even the relation with the Saint Crusades that is often misinterpreted. Right, the fact that Saint Francis criticized Crusaders in that specific, in the siege of Damietta and all what was happening in Egypt is not a criticism as many think of the crusade at all. Right, if somebody has ever studied these sources in the life of Saint Francis, there's absolutely nothing to do with any remote possibility of Francis being opposed to the concept of crusade at all. Right, also this is for the broader picture. Like, if you think that Christianity is about pacifism, well, just know that chances are that you basically know nothing about Christianity, as much as there cannot be, by definition, independently from any personal opinion, like a Christian that is at the same time a pacifist. Right? They are two mutually exclusive ideas, and this has nothing to do with militarism either, because apparently people can't reason by radical extremistic dichotomies, and understanding that the middle ground that is actually the sap of science, faith, reason, and civilization. But in fact is sometimes asking too much. But Francis was a man of the world in his early life, and as a man of the world, a nobleman, a knight, right? Less an aristocrat, given the Italian communal ruling class, the elites were so by census, not by blood necessarily, and that's also, in fact, Francis' background is very interesting culturally, right? Here we stop, in fact, for a while, deepening his characters. Right, he was born in either 1181 or 82 in Assisi, so this commune of central Italy in Umbria, an area that is, of course, by European standards, was quite developed, but also kind of wilder than Lombardy or Tuscany, and still very, in fact, involved in this atrocious intercommunal wars, and also, however, quite thriving economically, so much that he was son of a rich merchant named Pietro Bernardone, who was probably originary of Lucca, actually. So he would have been a Tuscan, telling the truth. And somebody has even come up with the idea that he could have been at least of Jewish origin. I'm not informed about the details of this, but it's an historiographical theory with some following. And his mother was, Francis' mother was perhaps here a Provençal woman, Pica, that's what the Italianized version, and he was named initially at baptism Giovanni. And this background is interesting because the father, coming back from one of those travels as a merchant, right, to France, that had made already his fortune, economically speaking, wanted to call him Francis, right, which was an unusual name at the time. Because that would be maybe free, like French franc, but probably also Frenchman, given that that fortune, and maybe also his mother were, his wife. Francis' father were coming from France, and this is interesting even just for the economical context. As you know, southern France and central Italy were very connected, economically speaking, at the time. And this was the age of blossoming properly with mercantile banking activities and so on. But it's still a primitive time in many ways. The young Francis spent his first youth by essentially in the extremely earthly lifestyle of the typical Assisian Italian aristocrats of the communes, right? As such, he belonged to a family of militares, or so that could produce this chivalric mobster military lifestyle fundamentally. He was so this had literally a clanic kind of mob-like behavior, right? Of this ostentation of wealth, power, often involved in violence, but also in station properly of luxury. Right, these bands of young men that roamed the city and often engaged in duels and spent their time in in happy company, let's say, and yet he also that was the training also in a paramilitary, if not in technically military sense, to which he was trained also to go at war for, and yet from the other side was the mercantile element. Right, this is typical of the Italian city-states, that the knight would be also something else. In this case, a merchant, and we know that the young Francis was a very promising kid. He was good-looking, fascinating, healthy. He would be the pride of a house like his own. He was involved in his own father's affairs, craft with this precious text. He immediately, since his youth, he showed this proximity to the poor, right? Often making very lavish gifts to them, and so there's been naturally there are many. You see, Francis' life eventually originated many stories, many anecdotes, and so on. It does seem that there was some kind of spiritual sensitivity already, kind of contrasting, or at least signing this more earthly dimension. That is a bit the leitmotif that, as we've seen, was at the root of this actual, heterodox but not heretical thinking, right? This incredible economical booms like the ones his father had achieved, that would contrast with the average 13th century moral and material misery that you can imagine from our standards. And that in this sense was starting to trigger spread some reflections about especially in a deeply Christian society, about the meaning of that and the morality, the ethics, or the ethical implications of that. And Francis also went at war. Assisi was at war with the neighboring Perugia, and he went down to this military expedition where the Assisians were defeated by the Perusians, so that Francis was captured and remained even prisoner for a while in the rival city. And men like him wouldn't risk that much. I mean, war was, as violent and dangerous as you can imagine, but let's say once captured, I mean, the aristocratic scions were, of course, ransomed, and the cities were all revolving. Also, importantly, from an economical point of view, around these this form of military economy, let's say. And it seems that even in prison, he was kind of joyful and spirited with his companions and yet there seems to be that after this experience, he felt ill. After being having been released, actually, he felt ill, and this changed a lot of things in his life. Not maybe decisively, but there was already something there that we understand, and that probably struck the deeper chord or triggered some further reflection. In fact, we don't really know, in spite of all the geography and so on, what were the actual circumstances of Francis', let's call it conversion, like to at least to the full, completely spiritual life. For even though we do have something about that from his first biographers, and it seems in some way that an important role in this had the frustrated will to be dubbed as a knight, which was something that this is important. We will see maybe in some videos about the nature of the Italian militia, what this factually meant. I mean, being a miles was not like being a knight, at least at some levels. I mean, the terms are, there is all terminological and juridical differences here, but let's say not all those who fought on horseback or could afford that were technically dubbed as knights, which was a much bigger deal, and especially in these communities was a very important ceremonies, the display of power, and so something that went very much beyond. It was, a dramatic way of political and social promotion, in spite of the lifestyle was technically the same. And we know that Francis was living properly as a soldier for the East, right, alongside the Bergen expedition to Greece. At that point, you know that Constantinople had already been conquered, so the Latins were, an expedition there was, of course, opening a lot of opportunities for young knights. Then there was still the idea of the crusade, of the pilgrimage in the Holy Land from there. However, he seemingly came back, right, from this alone, right. We don't know whether, I mean, it seems so, right. This initial illness, and this sense that, however, he was not perfect enough to undertake that enterprise, and that especially this kind of vocation that he already felt, inspired by the weak, the sick, the rejected, the marginated, right? So such compassion turned quite soon in a sort of love fever for his neighbor, right? That in some ways was not understood in the communities of the time, especially for a man of his status. In a way, he was deemed to be foolishly generous, right? That, all these expensive gifts to the poor, well, what for exactly, right? The poor were a normal presence in pre-industrial societies, and especially at this point, right, as we've seen it, monetary economy was just reviving in a truly consistent sense. So it was normal to, you can imagine, these cities or the villages or being normally inhabited at its margins by these people really lived out of nothing. In a way, it was kind of easier at the time. Life was tougher at the time. People would adapt even to that. And yet, it's important here to understand the deeper meanings that also are connected to Francis' chivalric background, because this idea of a great generosity was a character typical of the liberality that was, a typical, fact feature of chivalry, of knighthood. This mission, in a sense, also of sacrifice and of self-sacrifice, spirit of abnegation, and so on, that was in fact, let's say, close to the mindset of a young man who dreamed of a chivalric, had dreamt at least that up to that point to a chivalric adventure. And some naturally, as they tend to rationalize everything forcefully, but that's not even the point considering the context, but have thought of this behavior as a symptom of a mental disorder of some sort, and it's possible at the same time. This is at least what his father believed, and many other people who, when Francis, like, to hear the story here, we cannot descend into the details, but sometimes he began to despoil himself of all his goods, right, to also look quite upset and having this almost transfiguration, right, and starting to reject the earthly goods and riches. And it's really important to understand, because it's typical of also many other conversions at the time. It was a shame, right? It was violently repressed by his father, who had him repeatedly segregated, with mental and physical violence properly. And his father had Francis interdicted, eventually disowned, right? And so, because this was not tolerable for a family of their status, these were people who had, in fact, to go at war, to manage large capitals, to have a political involvement in the communal events, in the internet, in the regional, let's say, policies and wars and so on. So what was that? Well, it was an even lack of an utter rejection of any responsibility of that kind. So secular, we're very often not as informed about secular ethics as opposed to the ecclesiastical ones, because it's still at the time, despite Italy and St. Francis being a great example of the rise of vernacular literature at the time, the spread of literacy among people and so on. But we can understand that, of course, that there was all a very sound and logical and iron cold, but still very, very concrete and obvious system of values that the laymen, and especially these ones endowed with great power, were called properly by the entire community to call. So this was a radical break with the culture of the time. It was literally mirroring the Gospels, phrases about pronounced by Jesus relatively to the fact that here even the military reference is important. It's not that that Jesus had come with the sword, that he would literally separate, he would put fathers and sons one against each other. So something like a radical break, something that had to be, in fact, biblically interpreted here as a full obedience, a full discipline, right? As an enormous sense of moral strength and pressure, as much as you could imagine the ones of knights were in a brutal, traumatic sense. And in fact, Francis in this, mirroring that aspect of in the Militia, but in Militia Christi, responded with a unexpected move. At least maybe unexpected is he appealed to the Bishop of Assisi, and in his presence he despoiled himself of any vest, basically rendering it back to the father, and proclaiming at that point of not having nor let's say, any father anymore in the physical sense of the term, and that he would have called Father only God. So this is a very traumatic event, really. In fact, he broke completely with his family, arguably with the seculum properly, and what all his lifestyle had been, right? And behind every poor, behind every sad person, Francis saw Jesus himself. One of his first activities at this point was the one of roaming the countryside around Assisi, restoring small churches that were abandoned and shattered. He was called to do so by visions, looking at the icon of Saint Damien, who would have told him to restore specifically one little church that eventually would become important also for Francis' cult. And that, so essentially summing in part some of these, what was already, as we've seen also before the foundation of the same mendicant orders, of which he would have been protagonist, still this, in a way, the Benedictine spirituality that had substantiated and kind of characterized and distinguished Western Christendom, that is properly the ora et labora. So not just an ascetic experience to court, but one aimed actually at also maintaining oneself, right? Working manually with hard labor, so restoring alone this thing and the structures. And so that is relevant because also in St. Francis' rule, eventually it said that you don't just have to literally live out of of alms. You have also to earn what you get, right? So, but what is enough for you to survive, and basically nothing else. That was the pauperistic instance, aside from the evangelical one. And in fact, as Christ was poor and naked, also Francis had decided to leave poor and naked. As we were saying before, the 13th century was a world of misery, but also of extraordinary fortunes. And Francis, uniforming to the model of the King of Kings, that had wanted to be born poor, stripped, devoid, deprived of everything, in the barn of Bethlehem, he chose poverty voluntarily. Right? He was asked. These are anecdotes, but in the time of his secular life, amongst this, riches and pleasure and so on, he was asked by his companions, "Well, who do you want to marry?" Right? Because the task, of course, of these young aristocrats was to make a fortune also through marrying a noble heiress, a noble girl with a rich dowry. And he answered, I will marry the fairest of all women. And he was referring to Madame Poverty with that. And with this, sending to the world of his time a message that was also a challenge, because as we've seen, that meant literally disowning great part of what essentially secular ethics was about. And if that was the world of the triumph of money, especially in this rich mercantile, say the trade hubs, let's say, he would have demonstrated not much to search it in turn as the poor that are not such by their own free choice, but to estimate it as less than the stones themselves. I used to say money properly has no value whatsoever. This was the yet radical but concrete opinion that the church had on properly the idea of profit in itself, even though it's not for how it had been interpreted up to that point. At least, of course, things changed also because it's not quite necessarily like that, right? The Gospels are, of course, extreme, but in an asymptotic sense, that is about looking at the spectrum of somebody's life and circumstances and choosing time after time what is the case. Otherwise, it wouldn't properly be a conscience of free will, and so the works wouldn't properly be. And so this was important and relevant to him, and that's what goes beyond the same idea of poverty. It's the idea of deprivation, of self-deprivation of all that wealth. Hell, this was a rich guy. He left everything, right, for real, and began to live in an incredibly harsh manner, psychophysically, so much that is, of course, the imitatio Christi substantiated in the suffering, and so the stigma later and so on. That's what they would have signified, right? So this was also the world in which science and culture were ever more appreciated. This was the world of universities, right? And he said Francis chose for himself, right? This is also important in a Christian perspective. It's not that he claimed that, as we will see, even the ecclesiastical hierarchy should have just been everybody like him. No, this was not the point, right? There is an imitative model, but in an exemplary sense, in a role that fits the broader community that is different in all its parts, right? He would have lived as a perfect ignorant, albeit he was not really an ignorant of the world, as we've seen, and on the contrary, properly as a crazy man, right? As a juggler, right? That Saint Francis is called juggler of God because of this joyful idea, right, of demonstrating that in the freely chosen abjection there is perfect happiness, right? And that living in poverty in this sense can mean to live happily. And so poverty as a joyful choice, right? Living, making penance, but without showing the fatigue and of the pain of penitence. This is really the transcendental element in here, that you would expect somebody to do this just for the sake of, the recognition of something, the ostentation of this, and instead, no, this is a private thing. You do it to strengthen yourself, to come closer to the real value of life and its essence, right? Despoiled of any distraction, fundamentally, and on the contrary, feeling the limits, even of your mind, primarily, and of your body, right? Consider the average person today exposed to the kind of lifestyle Francis actually undertook, is, you wouldn't last a day, right? And because today's will is nothing, right? People today are stop being hungry, stop striving, they think they strive. They don't know anything about that. If they only saw how their grandparents lived, they would immediately feel ashamed of themselves. But of course, this is not something that we like to recall. And I'm not saying that, again, living with our quality of life that is literally the best in the history of mankind is bad. It's just that should be commensurate to, to an actual leap forward, a push forward, a greater motivation. None of that, right? And that's the proof that without pressure, without discipline, without some, coercion, that there can't be an autonomous, right, largely in humanity, a fort just by itself. It's simply a scientific principle. It's not even an ethical one. It's literally, we know that that's the state of all being. Like, if they're not stimulated, they lazy down, right? And the worst, though, is that humans are provided with reason to understand that that's not really the choice. Instead, they don't seem to invest any value, not even properly in this scientific experiment, to understand how much they can be and how few they actually are. So Francis is not just an asceticist of renunciation. There's even more to this. He subverted, as we've seen, the values of his times, right? He literally put upside down the current judgments. He seemed to leave Christianity as a continuous paradox, and at the same time with the simplicity and the literal adhesion to the gospel in an absolute way. That was, of course, the source of imitation. And from a man like him, that could have had everything from life, and that had renounced to everything to follow Christ's example, you would expect, especially in that time, a harsh judgment on the church of his time and on the weakness of the priesthood, because many perfectly orthodox asceticists had actually expressed judgments of such kind that were at the same time, however, characteristics also of heretical propaganda. And that was exactly the moment of greatest spread of this idea. We've seen that how this criticism towards the temporal character of the Roman Church at this point was criticized both, say, internally from within orthodoxy, because of all the instances of the failed hopes of reformation in a merely spiritual sense, and on the other hand, and sometimes you wouldn't even understand, especially in this ascetic milieu, outside of the church. Well, that was a bit the leitmotif of the criticism from the heretical side to the Roman Church. And instead, this is crucial about Francis, that he insisted on the necessity that the priesthood must be loved and respected without pretending from them proofs of, Christianity superior to those that they are able to give. Right? This is an incredibly deep argument, because it's very often properly the anti-clerical one is usually done. That is to say, well, the clergy is too earthly, is too corrupt. Yes, it is, because what the rest of what is the rest of humanity exactly like? And I know you could say, but the priests, in this sense, they're a militia. They should be under disciplinary standard. Should be the example. Yes, they should, but that's still a human institution. And here, Francis was, from one side, revering the institution at the same time, but also giving to its humanity a great chance, right? This is not like a dualistic idea for which, there is just, in fact, among the Cathars, a spiritual dimension that is betrayed by matter, by actual people, by the flesh, right? By this corrupted, evil system. It wants also to bring us down, because the church was, so rich, and so given that creation, according to this Gnostics, would be, just a satanic product, right? We have to depreciate everything, from the cross to the incarnation of Christ that never existed. And so, what are these people that are so lavishly clothed, and they represent the hierarchies? Francis goes completely beyond, of course, any possible criticism, because it's not by criticizing these institutions, but only by acting to be a better individual that you can start changing the system by imitation, right? And the fact that this is what also we have lost by standards of morality and decency, that the idea of showing to others in a world we will also impute with a sense of honor, right? In a knight like Francis, we will understand that, and also still the ecclesiastical hierarchies had that enormous sense of themselves, more or less on the same, in fact, secular, moral basis. There were people coming from the same aristocratic families their own, right? Considered that as well. That the example of perfect orthodoxy and perfect poverty, and perfect Christ's imitation, was a great sense, a great humbling example that would make the consciences literally shaken. And this is extremely important. It's accepting the world for what the individual responsibility is made by, and setting the example by yourself, not pretending that there is some kind of kind of abstract logic or impersonal intervener that has to put things together from the top, because society doesn't work according to you, and you don't have to do anything about that. Also because, frankly, you don't even know how to navigate yourself in your life, and how can you have an idea of how society fundamentally should work. That's the first moral point. Is an incredible and despicable act of arrogance and of pride and self-entitlement that, not surprisingly, often comes from those who really can't see very far away from their nose and their limitation. Well, Francis cuts this thing completely short, right? And it's no surprise that heresies were crushed literally by the Mendicant orders in this regard, and what all that nonsense had meant in attitudes that are always resurging. Like historically, even today, we're witnessing that, with the difference that even the average person today is much less morally equipped to have this kind of resistance and this kind of principle, and pretending that, in fact, falling into dualism once again, even from the side that technically hasn't come up with that, because at some point you don't understand the consistency of that. You're mostly on the defensive. You don't have any mover by your own standard. Even when you think you have, is actually something very, very limited and inefficient most of the time. It's not built by a constant discipline and even harshness with yourself, accepting that suffering is actually a very positive thing for the development of civilization, but not by imposing something on others, or from dictating simply what should be done with somebody that doesn't actually even understand what that means. I mean, that can be a provisional, emergential tool that civilization also works with, but the ideal would be persuading, is of actually convincing and properly making people understand why that should be the case. Because otherwise you can't make that thing last for very long either. So it's properly, strategically speaking, not that of a good option. So starting from the individual is the key, because nobody is, collectivity is nothing but a sum of individuals, right? And even when things go systematically wrong, because physically the system is more complex, the only the only force that can put an end to that are still the individuals. There is nothing outside of the individuals. Nobody has anything, no idea whatsoever, whatever exists outside of themselves. If they are, by the way, already understanding kind of decently what is happening within themselves, that is an enormous issue, is exactly what also most of the problem is factually about. So, say that Francis was led at some point to be quoting contradiction in front of a priest that notoriously lived in sin, right? And if he had not denounced him, they could have thus say that Francis was one of his accomplices. And if he had done it, on the contrary, it could have been possible to state that Francis' respect towards the ecclesiastical hierarchy was not complete. And Francis instead limited himself to kiss the hands of that priest, that, as he had, touched the body of Christ. And so this is relevant because, as you'll see, the disciplining of the Franciscan movement, eventually also properly in the creation of the order and so on, was not easy, right? Because some instances were so extreme that, of course, some Franciscans believed that not, let's say, that there was something wrong in part, even in being integrated in the church, say, hierarchy, and so for what it derived, also for what they thought that the church. Imagine all the people that had joined also the Franciscan movement in still thinking that this was objectively similar in aspect, exteriorly to other papiristic evangelic movements that were critical of the same church. So the church's temporal character. So this was an incredibly firm stand that Francis took to confirm that there was no disobedience to the church whatsoever, and that was simply not an option, but there couldn't be. The church is ecumenic, is universal, right? All mankind has been exposed to the good news, so nobody can pretend that the individual commitment here can be can depend on just the fitness of other earthly deeds, right? The church is a spiritual body, and the value that lays within it, again, cannot be subordinated to other considerations, and the absolute value of it. So again, it's mostly about testing your own faith to it than criticizing the others, which has an exemplary meaning as well, because that's what the same gospel is about. And the fact that Francis' lifestyle, in all his simplicity and poverty, could have made him pass for a perfect cater, quite literally, I mean, the perfects, were the only ones that fasted, that lived in this terribly deprived sense, and that could thus belong to the club of the perfect, but the others were just kind of, it was a device, so the Gnostic dimension of Catharism. Well, Francis was perfectly aware of, right? But this could easily be remedied by differentiating always through a model of charity. For example, the austere Cathars could not eat anything that was the product of generation, because they believed essentially that generating was just essentially injecting in the world yet another soul that was thus trapped by this terrible thing of existence, being enclosed in that flesh that was a satanic creation. Very good outlook on life. So they wouldn't eat. They were vegans basically. They wouldn't eat any meat, any eggs, any milk derivatives, and so on. Instead, Francis ate always everything that he was offered, which is yet another. It's called being grateful for life and existence in general, and thus not questioning, what was the cause of that, but simply accepting it as a gift, as a subsistence, because literally that's what eventually the mendicant lifestyle substantiated itself in, right? This donations, this also work that was extremely miserable and that had to maintain also such standards. I mean, it couldn't just be about storing stuff that was being given. It was about really the minimum for going on with the Christian imitation, and basically it. Also, the Cathar masters preached that, as we've seen, the world was essentially all a trick of the god of darkness and of matter, that creation was made by the evil god, right? Because according to them, all the Old Testament is just talking about Satan, right? Not the same God of the New Testament. And Francis, aside from, of course, let's not comment further, but Francis answered writing the very famous Canticle of the Creatures, or Brother Sun, right? That is not just a great poetry, it's also a perfect treatise of anti-Cathar theology, because he blesses nature as God's creation in all its beauty, in all its positivity, in those aspects that only through that lifestyle can be further appreciated. I don't know whether it's the case of reading the Canticle of Creatures, because let's see here, because it's really it's not just the content that is beautiful in its simple poetry, let's say, but which is also a very important literary evidence, by the way, of the Umbrian vernacular of the time, which is what you would expect Francis to speak. Of course, we're reading in translation, but it's also very important for the events of Francis' life, given that it was composed actually in the very last phase of his life, when he was seriously ill, and that he would be contented with, up to the point of thanking God for a sister bodily death, right? Which is an extraordinary acceptation of the condition of human nature in a benevolent sense, in a positive sense, without which you really can't go very far. In fact, we can't read it. In fact, Goin says, "Most high, all-powerful, good Lord, yours are the praises, the glory, the honor, and all blessing. To you alone, Most High, do they belong, and no man is worthy to mention your name. Be praised, my Lord, through all your creatures, especially through my Lord Brother Sun, who brings the day and you give light through him, and he is beautiful and radiant in all his splendor. Of you, Most High, he bears the likeness. Praised be you, my Lord, through sister moon and the stars. In heaven you formed them clear and precious and beautiful. Praised be you, my Lord, through brother wind and through the air, cloudy and serene, in every kind of weather through which you give sustenance to your creatures. Praised be you, my Lord, through sister water, which is very useful and humble and precious and chaste. Praised be you, my Lord, through brother fire, through whom you light the night, and he is beautiful and playful and robust and strong. Praised be you, my Lord, through sister mother earth, who sustains us and governs us, and who produces varied fruits with colored flowers and herbs. Praised be you, my Lord, through those who give pardon for your love and bear infirmity and tribulation. This is actually, my opinion, if you allow me, the most beautiful of the. Praise you be you, my Lord, through those who give pardon for your love and bear infirmity and tribulation. Blessed are those who endure in peace, for by you, Most High, they shall be crowned. Praised be you, my Lord, through our sister bodily death, from whom no living man can escape. Woe to those who die in mortal sin. Blessed are those who will find your most holy will, for the second death shall do them no harm. Praise and bless my Lord, and give him thanks, and serve him with great humility. Now there is a beauty that can't reach, can't be reached through words. So well, I'll leave to you any consideration. But this is one of the single most beautiful pieces of Western spirituality in its simplicity, which is often the whole nature of genius, right? Not being overly complicated, sophisticated, abstract speculator, fundamentally being quite concrete about what is really that gets down to in so many ways. And so Francis' love for nature, the animals, his albeit legendary but still famous episodes to the preaching to birds, and also the wolf of Gubbio, for example, are quite notorious. In fact, for which the love, right, is, and also towards, as we've seen, inanimate object and even naturalistic phenomena is surpassed only by the love for humanity. And for this reason, also Francis has been seen a kind of an ecologist in a medieval perspective. This love for nature in an anti-catedralistic, heretical sense, and contempt towards creation, what we are given, even just as a possibility to improve ourselves through knowledge is extraordinarily ungrateful, right? And so in any case, from this aspect, the Franciscan preaching in favor of internal peace is not just as an absence of war, right? As a simply ascetic saying, okay, view of tribulation that still crushes you, but properly the idea of interior serenity in this, in what is life as a difficulty for everybody, right? The capacity of loving and of forgiving, the joy of leaving. How many people actually even stop for thinking to realize this in the harshest of times? Because it may seem like, okay, what you wouldn't tell to a person who is evidently in utter pain because of unspeakable things that can happen in somebody's life. But in general, right, in a normal condition, what is that cannot really motivate you in the joy of living? Again, this is not, again, there are some pathologies that are serious, must be treated. In that sense, it's difficult and tricks your mind, absolutely. But this is exactly the point. Pathologies are something that, and sometimes it's hard to see a boundary, but how much is it just pure lack of gratitude and, kind of hatred towards yourself at the end of the day, and no constructive and productive attitude whatsoever, right? There are some, the events of the birds and the wolf of Gubbio. The wolf one is interesting because it's being paralleled also to a metaphor to, it says that St. Francis spoke to animals and animals would listen to him. And so there is naturally a metaphorical meaning in that. I mean, this is not whether about he actually spoke to birds and they would stop listening to him or things like these. It's, of course, living creatures do bond among each other. But the episode of the wolf there is often also intended as a sort of metaphor towards properly evil people to reject emarginated outcasts. And the wolf, literally, as you could imagine, as a berserker, some of these brigands that lived in the wilderness and that terrorized the countryside. And so at the time, as you know, it was quite a common thing. And so the story went by the fact that the wolf, it was this terrible wolf around Gubbio. It was yet another Umbrian town that we will talk about eventually, also Francis tours, let's say, because that also, even international dimension is important. Here was happening in the places that Francis lived most of his life, and this wolf was terrible because he ate animals and people alike. And so you would imagine even the hatred attached, and yet there is this experience for which Francis basically explains. He reaches the wolf. He's not. You see, he had been living with his companions in these excursions, also in the forest, in areas that were inaccessible, terrifying, cold. The Apennine is an incredibly cold place in winter. It's one of the coldest places in Europe. These people would live there in the wilderness, right? And so the wolf do. And so the explanation for Francis was this wolf is just hungry. So if there can be an agreement, like a forgiveness, first of all, from the side of the inhabitants of Gubbio, that can regularly feed this wolf, that evidently doesn't have else, right? And so can't help but to live like that. There can be a peaceful coexistence. And so it teaches about forgiveness, about love for all God's creatures. It can be extended to, in a sense, even to a criminal, in a sense. And so that there can be a common ground where things can be fixed and things are not going to be perfect, but still that we can make the difference between the worst keeping to go on, say, and yet a compromise or an adaptation, some agreement of sorts. So this naturally takes different. It's just like an exemplary, anecdote, but it can be declined different ways. Of course, it can't be always just an agreement, but still, the message is that sometimes there is also logic that we are just not, even in tragedy, able to see that can actually put an end to further tragedy, and so that we have the possibility of making a difference in that regard. And yet, in spite of this sweetness, let's say, Francis, if you just read his biography, wasn't at all like a meek, mild, kind of weak, person, right? He was actually quite harsh and quite squared and quite aside his Spartan lifestyle, but he had very clear ideas about what needed to be done, and also in order to maintain the discipline among his community, he would take very very effective measures, and he was a decisive person. So this character is interesting because it shows the mind of somebody who had been in the world, who knew what power was, who knew what money was, how to properly manage, possessions actually, and had seen war, who had received a military training, who was about to go like for a soldier abroad. So this aspect, right, mostly the sweet side of it, but actually is paralleled by a harsh one. You see, even in the creator's Canticle, there is a consideration for different elements of nature that are also symbolic in a way that doesn't just contemplate. This is the complete vision of the church, both the Uranic and Telluric element, actually, that are always in this order, in the comprehensive order in which there is both things, right? So the condition of poverty is not paralleled by just as a subservience of a meekness or a subjection, right? It's actually a constant proof, even though in the rule, of course, there is the Christian principle of not reacting to wrongdoing, to accepted poverty as a condition, but everything that you shouldn't be scared about anything that is going to happen to you. Just let it happen to show other people how far somebody's integrity can arrive, right? So it's obviously Francis embodies one extreme of the gospel, in a sense, which is always about a double threat. That is not always about you should just be like this and not like that. That's also why civilizationally Christianity had such an astonishing success and was able to regulate certain dynamics by accompanying some of the most violent ones. In fact, as we will see now, Francis' participation to the crusade is yet another proof of the fact that even war was present in the world, and as such, it had to be also waged in a way that it's as if humanity has at that point to decline itself in the best way in every single kind of circumstances. War cannot be eliminated either. So this aspect is very fascinating. And this is the point, that by choosing poverty, humility, and obedience, even in absolute terms, Francis didn't want to dictate a universally valid model. This is the greatness of a civilization. Such extremely harsh norm of life that he had chosen was just his own, and of those who had freely wanted to follow it. And yet for them, this norm was absolute and did not admit any exception. So you have freedom, but freedom to regulate yourself in the harshest ways. And this is the value of liberty. Francis did not condemn power, nor knowledge, nor possessions as such. This is yet another thing. This was not communism. He just stressed that his own, as Francis, way to Christ consisted in renouncing these things with absolute firmness. Somebody else would have done another thing, because your own way to Christ is your own. And this is central to the idea. And Francis probably also saw, probably in a worded way, that in an ever-growing one, that the Franciscans were instead, already in his lifetime, becoming cultivated, accepting gifts and riches, even though these were not essentially cashed by the order when it was created, but by the Holy See. And so some of them, even with the excuse to better serve the neighbor, asked that the Francis rule itself that he had drafted in 1221 would be kind of modified. So this was absolutely outrageous in that perspective, because Francis at that point was actually forced in front of an important choice, because at that point the order, let's say, was being created. So the papacy was pressing for giving to the many Franciscans that had started to grow. We would talk about these things in the video about the Mendicant Order, so you can check that for further information. But let's say asked Francis to write another rule, or at least an updated one, right, for the new situation. So this happened in 1223, and there is an enormous effort displayed in the properly in the making of this rule and what is written in it, by pretending that the Franciscans would remain absolutely faithful to it. That is, basically accepting it literally, and especially he stressed this without comment, that is to say, without interpretations. So he made this enormous effort to essentially balance the needs of this growing community that naturally contained lots of people who were starting to become endowed with properties, because also you cannot really have anything organized and not even a discipline at that point. And so that was a bit the point of this pauperistic evangelical movements, and the obvious necessity for them to be brought under the ecclesiastical hierarchy, and from the other side, however, remaining faithful to what he thought had been for himself the way. And so if somebody had to follow his way, there couldn't be like a personalization of it, right? Because those people were following him, not eventually what, right? So this could kind of distract others to teach them something that he had not wanted factually. So he stressed importantly that the rule had to be followed literally, and making an effort also to be very precise in those terms, and so that nobody could interpret it personally, just sticking to it for what it was. And so unavoidably, even in Francis' best effort, any text is interpreted in different ways according to the person at the end of the day. And so this generated some issues that we have discussed also in other videos. Think about all the heterodox, when not heretical, movements that actually were born out of Saint Franciscanism at some point, and that were in fact put down, and that the Franciscan order would effectively be transformed by the church in a copy of the Dominican one in organizational terms, right? So, and much changed from Francis' life in an example in practice. But let's say that the originality of the rule is still an important point of reference, that is, the Franciscans still follow their best, and that is, however, a historical product, and that, of course, the experience of an individual cannot be even the experience of another one. So this is kind of obvious. But speaking of the more international thing, so Francis at some point, he actually roamed, he traveled a lot. He was to Rome, he traveled all over Italy. At some point he tried to get in the Balkans, but it was a storm that prevented it. He wanted to go to North Africa, but also even in there he felt ill, if I'm not wrong, at some point. And then some Franciscans, when arriving in Morocco, were killed, were martyrized by the local Islamic government, and so that advised him not to go further. But yet there is this, and so there are all the various events. The meeting with Innocent III, bit of a legendary one that didn't actually brought to anything written, but that is a bit this topic movement meeting of the most powerful pope in history in Francis, and the opening of this, great supporter of the ecclesiastical hierarchy and temporal power, and in fact the papal monarchy and education and so on, would actually try to would actually accept Francis in his project and given him his consent for preaching, which was something new, and that's what also eventually differentiated the mendicant orders from the monks, which they technically were not, but still they had this faculty of preaching, right? And they were not clergy purple and sand, because Francis' life was a lay choice, right? It was a layman choice, right? He had started preaching fundamentally alone by himself, and that's also how he had gained so much consensus. As you know, it opened also to the female congregations. Saint Clare of the same Assisi, he gave the same poor course, typically the Umbrian pastoral clothes to wear, and so the Clarisses were born, and so all the various the secondary, the tertiary order, so these other opportunities for other laymen to kind of participate to different degrees to that experience. So that goes, we've talked about them in other videos, and that's not here the point. Here we concentrate on Francis' life, and the crusading experience is fascinating because this is contextual to the last acts of his existence, that however left with important consequences. It's this journey between 1219 and 1220 in Egypt, following a crusading expedition. So this is the battle of the siege of Damat, and so there was properly battles going on between the Franks and the Sultanate. And Francis would just be, we don't know more than much, but he was there behind the Christian lines in the camp, and between a clash and another, he crossed over the lines, the battle line, and he passed to the Egyptian lines and wanted to and managed to speak to the Sultan of Cairo, Al-Kamil. And probably this is a true story. Like Al-Kamil actually met with Francis, had this discussion with him, with this strange Frank, let's say. In fact, quite, even the name would suggest that, that in his poor clothes seemed so similar in a way to the Sufis and the Dervishes, so this mystical sect of Islam, right? And because, of course, this ascetical, experiences were present all over monotheism and beyond at the time, and so Al-Kamil was, listening to him, and Francis proposed, of course, he brought the Evangelion to him, and yet, of course, he refused conversion, but he actually permitted Francis to preach in the Holy Land. That point was under the Egyptian Sultanate, so that's quite interesting, by the way, because it reveals still the those times forms of tolerance that after all were okay. Well, after all, there were Christians there, there were the holy places, the same Muslim government, of course, benefited from Christian pilgrimage. It was an open area, and so on. And from this visit, the idea of crusade and the start even in the concept of mission as a work of conversion, properly of the infidel, would start because of this grant that the Sultan gave to Francis. Also, Franciscans today are still considered by the Church the custodians of the Holy Land. That, as you know, was never recovered. Yes, there was the episode of Frederick II who got, in fact, Jerusalem back, let's say, as a, at least as an open city under formal Christian control, but still within the sultanial possessions as a compromise, right, which avoided a war between the empire and Egypt, but let's say the Pope was not very happy with that. But that's another story. Eventually, the city, as you know, was eventually sacked by the Khwarezmians. Then eventually came back, probably under Islamic rule, and that it had never left after the defeat of Aten and the siege of conquest of Jerusalem by Saladin. So ideally, those lands were and are still today, right? Ideally, from the Christian side, kept by the Franciscans in memory of Francis' missionary activity in the Holy Land. Now, coming back to Europe, tired, even though he was barely 40 years old and sick. Even think about what it means to live under the weather, literally for decades, right? And so, after the drafting of the two rules, as we've seen at a short distance temporarily from one another, because he was asked by the Pope to consider this, the situation. He withdrew, right, ever more in silence. And it's a strange situation because, the Franciscan order blossomed everywhere, right? The St. Francis had organized the missionary expeditions, especially the one in Germany was extremely successful. The Franciscans all over Europe began to organize themselves in ways that, without even actually knowing much about Francis himself. This was just this rule that had arrived from Italy. It was from this man who was, prodigiously, chaste and, and absolutely, say, conforming to the Christ example, and so the church also intervened in the regulation of these orders. As you know, they would fundamentally become the most educated ones in Europe. They were the Dominicans were, with Domingo of Guzman in Spain, had done their part. They had mostly been created. You see, the Franciscans, as you know, had this poverty bias, let's say, while the Dominicans were all about education to dialectically contrast the heretics in public. These people were in the world because they were laymen themselves, as we've seen. So eventually the Franciscans picked also the Dominican education bias themselves. So they, as I was saying before, they were kind of uniform in a way, or at least, adapted. And all this was, you can imagine from Francis' perspective that after all had lived a very Spartan lifestyle. Had traveled and had also with peril, with difficulties, you can imagine at the time, but he probably wouldn't even expect to acquire this enormous success, and surely he was glad of that, but still worried that this whole thing would escape his, in fact, his control through this regulation. So his last years were ever more troubled. It's as if while the Franciscan order was triumphing, Francis didn't belong to it anymore. He was venerated everywhere, and yet, because it had an enormous success, sometimes it's difficult for us to understand these things, like how at the beginning of the 13th century, how could a single person's acts could have such an enormous clamor, and think about, in fact, how deeply the world had been struck by the example of this person, how much that was properly appreciated to spread so fast among the masses, right? This was not an elite thing. And so he retreated eventually to this hermitic location that is the Mount of Diverne, that was granted by the local Count of Chiusi, as his own words would say. This is a place where you want to experience like harsh, isolation and hermetic experience in places abandoned by mankind. go there, right? Very tough Apenninic area in 1224, and that's where he received the stigmata. And so, in a tormented psychophysical condition, of course, who was again ill, and so his condivision, his sharing of the sufferings of Christ, offered a new face to Christianity, right? Not much more the religion of triumph, symbolized by Christ in glory, but also the one of the sharing fact of the pain of the last and of redemption witnessed by Christ suffering nailed to the cross. And in fact, after Francis, the same symbology and imaginary of Christian faith would be changed forever. Right? In 1226, he was brought back to his beloved Assisi because he was basically dying, and in fact, that's where he passed away. And 2 years later, he was made saint, right? And on his tomb was erected, you can still see today, one of the most beautiful churches in entire Christendom, where Giotto also illustrated his life, this beautiful cycle that, as you know, with Giotto, we are really at the peak of medieval Western artistic civilization. And in fact, much of the pictures I've inserted here are from there. So it's very difficult to speak of Francis of Assisi, because it's one of those figures that, of course, we will never fully understand, right? That there is something in the same meaning of his experience, the stigmata hidden up to his death, where eventually were praised, but on his corpse and so on. There is something also properly to Christian spirituality that is being forgotten. In a part, you can see it coming back. It's mostly probably a communitary idea, but also knowing the origins and knowing that this is not just, there's not just a rite, it's not just a formal exterior, just kind of a something that gives you some support, but after all, you can simply share because you're part of a group or something. It's not, of course, what Christianity is. That's what I think all good Christians know this. It's just that Francis' life is a testament to the individual will and responsibility and self-sacrifice capacity, which is what is properly what humanity is being endowed with by God. And of course, we're talking about models that are lost in. Even just out of humility, you cannot think to parallel St. Francis, nor you should, because that's not actually what Francis wanted, as we've seen, for anybody. That should be, again, a free choice. So it depends on you at the end of the day, what you want to be and how. And that can never be eliminated from a healthy life and for what this means for the community and so on. But there is also something lost properly in time and in history that should be recovered in order to understand the significance of these figures, right? It's not just like a slogan or a bunch of anecdotes or even a YouTube video that will explain you what this is. There is an enormous historiography on St. Francis. I don't even know, as a medievalist, I must say, first of all, that I've never studied this stuff. Yes, of course, basically I had to, but I've never gone into that degree of depth for which I know exactly what historiography is. But in general, sometimes I think that people believe that, I don't know, when it comes to history of religions or something like that, people who study these things are just, believers themselves. And first of all, it shouldn't be even an interesting point, because, unless you know the people themselves. But say, secondly, I think that most people do not understand or know what's the magnitude of these historiographical branches properly, even in a secular sense, right? The fact that medievalistics studies these things because they are a scientific and rational necessity for the understanding of history of humanity. My impression is that that most people believe that just, private Christians study these things and the rest of the world doesn't. I mean, Western academies, the most secular public nature, thrive with these topics because they are obviously, for any medievalist or anybody who wants to understand anything like about the Middle Ages, you cannot ignore this stuff. And that's yet another thing that as I was saying in the beginning, I realized if I make a video about history of Christianity, people do not seem properly to be that interested in the first place, comparatively speaking. And again, I understand that. I mean, I understand, I see there what the logic is, but of course I refute it, I reject it. But secondly, I fear that properly the same world, the same culture, the same identity that emerged from this world, that was informed by a figure like Francis, but many other religious ones, are not capable of understanding basically anything about themselves anymore, because they properly don't have the dimension that these things even existed, and what they meant, and why they were so important. Right? These things would have been important in a scientifically and rational world, even if, Christianity had disappeared at the time and we were something completely different at this point. And this point is missed, in my opinion. This is what I also make all these videos about medieval Christianity, also about our religions, as you've seen. We talk about, paganism, we talk about Islam. It's not a big deal. Of course, the Christian aspect for a channel mostly based on medieval Europe is crucial and fundamental, right? And I fit too in this world because, I mean, at least if you are a European by, traditionally, it sounds weird to say traditional at this point, but I mean, to distinguish from naturally all the people from different cultural, religious backgrounds that live in Europe today. But let's say, you still are a Christian, whether you like it or not. Even if you're an atheist, it doesn't matter what you think. You still are, because your whole value system is informed by these ideas. And even if you don't even know it, or you want to deny it, or you don't see it, but so it is. So I cannot understand literally how the hell it is possible to actually even this of course as a word significance, because Christendom is universal, but let's say also for other cultures, right? The same Christendom, influenced them in a degree. Historically, the world has known each other, let's say. And so I really can't see why this wouldn't be so relevant, right? And so obviously, something you couldn't do without, at least in the essentials, in the foundations. This video is fundamentally it. Again, we could make 300 videos about Francis of Assisi. We could, if you had to exhaust even just a minimal part of the historiography existing on this stuff, you would never end. But that's for telling you that these are not just, strange things, episodic ones, irrelevant ones after all. You quite cannot, again, as I often say, pretending to be a Westerner and, at the same time ignoring these things automatically admits that you're really not a Westerner. And that's what the West is forgetting, because they think still, they are West, but they of course, in their ignorance, they don't understand why they're not anymore. And this has nothing to do with the attitude they have towards Christianity. This is literally the fact that you ignore a piece of information that is, of macroscopic impact for the definition of your own identity, that you do not understand anymore. It's like the Bible. How many people do actually study the Bible, study theology, or study, I mean, it's like, Richard Dawkins has said, theology is useless because God does not exist. I mean, this speaks literally to the radical level of cultural underdevelopment, complete lack of any scientific culture and education that the West has sunk to. It's an abomination of the dignity of mankind. And that's the problem that we're facing now. Because it's not about being one against the other, it's about properly sinking at a lower level collectively, which is an utter shame. And so there's an anecdote that is interesting about Francis that you see, thinking about even the fortune that his figure had, all this dramatic, artistic, and civilizational output that his figure was able to inspire, he would have probably been disappointed if he had seen, I don't know, Giotto illustrating his own life in this, beautiful cycles and all the wealth but Francis had chosen to die on naked earth, right, on bare earth, and so he would have not really liked such fun, let's say, and it's likely. And yet there is a meaning in that probably resumes anecdotally this intention that when he was young, when he still dreamt to become a knight, he had predicted the same, because he stated, "One day I will be a great prince." For today, we stop here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.